Dr. Srividya Iyer, who is the program coordinator of the Prevention Early Intervention Program for Psychosis here at the Douglas, and on the faculty in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill. And the title of her talk is The Role of Families in First Episode Psychosis.
So maybe part of the time during the panel discussion can be spent on whether or not it's a coincidence that the two people replacing the two speakers who were supposed to come from India are of Indian origin. So that can be a topic that can be discussed during the panel. So clearly 20 minutes is not enough to discuss a topic of this significance, the role of families in first episode psychosis. So there are large chunks of the literature that I will be leaving out, like the literature on family interventions, on family burden, and focusing on very sort of specific things that we can talk about in 20 minutes. And hopefully during the panel discussion, again, if there are topics related to this that people would like to discuss, I'd welcome you to join in. So I guess there's no need to advocate for why we should be investigating family perspectives, or why we should be including and involving families in the treatment of young persons with psychosis, but just sort of a brief summary of some of the key findings in the early psychosis literature. There's a lot of evidence now that suggests the role of family support or family involvement in predicting whether or not people will engage in services and stay in treatment, whether or not people will take medications as prescribed, how they respond in terms of symptoms, number of hospitalizations, whether they go back to work or school, and whether they stay there. And of course, lots of influences on help seeking, when they seek help, how they seek help, who seeks help on their behalf is often family and other caregivers. Yesterday, Deborah presented sort of individual interview-based perspectives on recovery, and as you clearly saw, one of the dimensions that she spoke about was social support and family relations and what an important role it plays in these perspectives. There's also evidence that shows that when you ask people what their treatment goals are when they're entering a first episode psychosis program, one sort of major category of goals, it's not the first, but it's one among the first few, relates to relationships with family, like I want to care better for my child, live happily with my husband, and so on and so forth. So we did this, I'm not going to be able to talk about this in any great detail, but I thought it's kind of interesting to at least briefly mention this before I move on to the topic I'd spend a bit more time on. We did this large study in 4 different provinces in Canada. It was part of a larger, so this was a small study that was part of a large study exploring perceptions about medications, specifically long-acting medications. But this sub-study looked at people's subjective perceptions regarding well-being and quality of life. And the way it did that was by just asking people some very simple, to fill up worksheets with some very simple questions like my life when I'm feeling at my best, what things I or others can do that would help me feel at my best. And so, clearly it generated tons and tons of statements and responses. So what I tried to do with the data was use a pile sort technique, which is a fairly common method in qualitative research and to some extent in cognitive science and information technology as well. So at this point, it's still preliminary because we'd like for more people to sort these cards. So we had 4 people who helped with the sorting, all with lived experience with psychosis. And basically they sorted all these statements were put on flashcards, and they sorted these flashcards into piles of similar themes and then gave them a name, and at the end of their sorting task, they kind of explained to me how they went about it and described these different piles. I'm not going to be talking about all of the findings, but the finding that's relevant to the topic for the presentation today is that one category that emerged as with complete sort of consensus among all 4 sorters as being clearly present in those cards reflecting people's perceptions about recovery was the role of, they had different labels for it, but it was basically the same thing: family or relationships, socializing, family, friends, relationships, connection to others, relationships with loved ones. So this was an important element of life when people are feeling at their best. So these are some examples of statements that people had put on their worksheets that fit in under this theme. Love, having family in my life that I get along with, playing with my kids, friendship, full of family, socializing, plugged into my family and friends. So clearly we were talking to some young people. So there was also another question that had been asked, what others can do that would help you feel at your best. And again, there was almost complete overlap between the four sort of sorters on these two aspects being part of what others can do. So the two aspects being understanding and support from others, and others give me space and respect. And some of the examples here were understanding and support from others, and I did not add that one. My spouse cooks dinner and helps have a clean house. Listen, understand my issues, anxieties, and worries. Getting calls from family. My family is there to listen when I'm struggling with the illness. And in terms of examples of statements that would indicate this idea of giving space and respect, leave alone, my family lets me go at my own pace, listens to me, don't talk. My family should help me but not become overbearing. So this is just another sort of indication, again, of the role of family and how important this role is in young people's perceptions about recovery. I do think, I mean, there is a lot of research, and we can talk later about it, but I still think that taking family member perspectives into account while shaping treatment interventions is not where it should be in the field. And I think that's very, very important implications. So here's, I mean, we did a small sort of analysis based on the concerns that the family members who attend family psychoeducation at the PEP program present. So they had a list of concerns that they had to rank order. And it would be it's interesting that in order of frequency of endorsement, the concerns listed by families, so these were families roughly within the first 3 years after the young family members had entered treatment into PEP. So the topmost concern was the self-esteem and identity of the young family member who was seeking treatment, followed by social behavior, followed by substance abuse, followed by medications. And it's kind of interesting because, I mean, I could easily think of interventions that we offer that somewhat target social behavior, substance abuse, and medications. And you could say that a meta goal of many of the interventions that are offered in specialized early interventions is to improve self-esteem and identity. But I couldn't really see how we talk about this with families, like how we address it, how we address this concern they have, or help them address this concern they have about their self-esteem and identity. So clearly we need to hear more from families before planning some of our family interventions. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different, like a little shift and talk about, Dr. Mala earlier and yesterday and this morning set the stage for some of the research we've been doing with the SCARF program in Chennai. And we've really decided, so we had an initial 2-year study and now we have a 5-year study, and we've really decided to put a lot of emphasis on family factors. And there was a reason for that. One of the things that Dr. Mala earlier alluded to was this finding about possibly better outcomes in developing countries compared to developed countries. And there's been a lot that's been written about it, and this finding seems to be somewhat true, at least for some parts of India. But yet little is known about why exactly are there outcome differences, what mediates these outcome differences. And we thought that maybe family factors seem like a good candidate for investigation. Why? Because one, a large number of people, and clearly this is not all, we saw that earlier today, but a large number of people with psychosis in India do live with their families. There's also a lot of literature showing and a lot of anecdotal clinical evidence coming from India that shows that families are very involved in every aspect of treatment in India, which is mostly provided in outpatient settings. And it also is very, very evident, especially for people who've come from other parts of the world like me, to hear that family structure and the values and expectations that you associate with families are shaped by sociocultural context. There's also a different sort of historical context to this, which I was reflecting on this morning, actually. You know, like in developing countries like India, when you talk about mental health care systems, families have always been sort of key players. And in part, it's because of this cultural framework where families are seen as central. And in part, it's because the state hasn't done much to provide for individuals with mental illnesses. And when you see the context in the West, it's somewhat different in the sense that it's only relatively recently that we've begun to truly acknowledge the positive role played by families. And in part, it was with a lot of advocacy with the NAMI in the United States and deinstitutionalization, forcing us to rely now on families. So it wasn't always the case that families were seen as partners or allies or as central to recovery. It's somewhat different in the specialized early intervention field, and I think that's that's one strength of the specialized early intervention for psychosis movement. The idea that, you know, one reason why we wanted to reduce delay was often delay was associated with what is known as social toxicity, or the impact it often had on people's relationships with friends and family. And in specialized early intervention, family has also always been central to screening and treatment, and there's a greater proportion of persons followed in specialized early intervention programs whose family members are involved, as is the case at pepp-montreal. And it's kind of interesting, there's a lot of research on how the role of ambient stress and how it contributes to relapses or even causes, like the expressed emotion literature. But there's very little that we know about what families do, how are they involved. In most of these other studies that I explained, it's usually like the presence of family or not, whether or not family was there or not, or very simple measures of family support or involvement. There's hardly any idea of what exactly do families do that's helpful. And very little has been done in terms of asking people who with psychosis and their family members what they see, in what their perceptions are about this role. So we did a focus group study. It was more like a pilot study before we planned this larger study that we're now undertaking. So we did focus groups at SCARF with patients with psychosis and their family members. And we did the same sort of focus groups here in Montreal, again with patients and families. So we had several focus groups that were conducted. There were certainly some common themes, and I'm not going to, it's really hard to present qualitative research in 20 minutes, let alone, try to do any justice to it. So, there were some common themes. One common theme being sort of being there. And this is sort of almost like a superordinate theme that was reflected in the quotes of patients and family members in Chennai and in Montreal. And this referred to the physical presence of the family in the context of caregiving, and also the wide range of support extended by them. And it was probably considered by both patients and family members as the most relevant component of the family's role. So here are some sort of quotes. The top one is from a father in Chennai. We must let the patient know that we are there for him or her. The bottom one is from a mother in Montreal. I just feel that as long as I'm there for her, and I can do the best that I can do. More or less all young persons followed at both these programs acknowledged the role and appreciated the family support that they were receiving. So these were some of the quotes reflective of that. I just expect somebody to be there. They can take care of the patient with love and affection. My father told me, you can come to my house. You need support, and they are there. While young people often appreciated the family support, sometimes it also entailed some loss of autonomy and a return to dependence. And this theme was especially reflected in some quotes from Montreal. So here it's really a touching quote. I cried, especially when my mom brought my clothes when I arrived here at the inpatient unit here at the Douglas. And I really found that hard. What about that was difficult? Well, it was as if I was losing my autonomy. There were clear differences between perceptions of family members and patients at both sites. So for example, family members thought it was a very important role for them to keep watching out for signs of relapse and to catch it quickly. And patients often got upset that any random changes in behavior were being misconstrued as signs of relapse. So here's an example. It's okay that I'm in my room and that I'm listening to music. That's not worrisome. What's worrisome is if I start being anxious about problems that are preoccupying me. But they mix the two up a bit. They have some difficulty discerning the difference. I'm going to skip that one. The family is involved, and this was reflected in the quotes at both sides, at so many different levels, help seeking, involvement in treatment, so attending appointments, creating the link with treatment providers, promoting or encouraging medication adherence, encouraging people to go back to work or to stay at work or school, providing a lot of emotional and psychological support. And this was the case at both sides. So a lot of patients spoke about how their family members often accompanied them to appointments. So here's an example. He drives me here to my appointments. He comes and picks me back up. He always asks me what the doctor said, and he's very helpful. There was an interesting difference in Montreal. It was usually for the initial few months after treatment that families often accompanied the patients. And in Chennai, this practice pretty much continued throughout the treatment. And the other difference was that in Montreal, the main encounter usually was with the patient, with maybe some part of the meeting devoted to a joint meeting if needed with the family member. And in Chennai, the family members were pretty much present throughout the family encounter, and we can talk about what may explain some of these differences. It's really hard to talk about all the themes of this, but what we found were some differences in the moral language. And in Montreal, for instance, the moral language stressed terms such as will, autonomy, personal responsibility, and independence. And intertwined with this was a legalistic language of rights like court order, consent, right to confidentiality. Here's an example of these are patients who are talking about disclosure and how they feel about disclosure to the family. All subjects are open, but I'd like it if they talk to me about it before. We could decide together, so that's the patient and the treatment team, if we should talk about it with the family or not. I don't want my family knowing too many things about me. There is a lot of stuff I haven't told them. And in Chennai, there was a lot of the moral language stressed terms such as obedience, respect, and conformity on the one hand, and love and affection on the other. And these differences could be linked to sort of notions of self and personhood, and it's hard to sort of talk about it. There's a lot of literature on the relevance of relatedness and interdependence in notions of self and how these could be shaped by cultural contexts. The political economies of healthcare, to what extent is the state involved? Our family is more involved in India because the state is sort of not, has delegated its responsibility to the family members. And on the other hand, is Canada sort of an example of what now in the literature is often called like a therapeutic state, where the state does a lot for people with illnesses and disabilities, but in some ways in the process disempowers patients and families and institutionalizes illnesses. There's also the question of morality of caring, and this is kind of interesting because what we found is that a lot of the language for caring and responsibility that was used in Chennai had imperatives, like we should do this, it is our duty, someone should take care and responsibility. And it kind of fits with this notion of morality coming from what's called dharma, or one's divine ordained sort of duty and responsibility as a parent or as a caregiver. And in Montreal, two families fulfilled their caregiving roles, and but there were some qualifications. They often spoke about their personal choice in undertaking these caregiving responsibilities, and also emphasized the responsibility of the ill family member to get better. And this fits very well with a lot of beautiful literature that's been done on morality of caring in the development that we don't in psychiatry often refer to. So I know I'm running out of time, so I have just two concluding sort of slides. What's interesting is that we can't any longer talk about families, because I find that the way family is defined is changing so rapidly across the world. Here, for reasons of immigration, displacement, different family structures, single-parent families, foster families, adoptive families. In India, with a rapid economic liberalization, the family structure is breaking down very quickly. So we don't know what family means anymore, and these definitions are changing, and that might be where to begin research with. And in general, I feel there is a need for more research. There's also a need for research looking at, I could barely find any studies, for instance, really documenting the uptake of family interventions and specialized early intervention. Like how many people attend family psychoeducation, any review papers on that, how many people are engaged, how many families are engaged in treatment, very little literature available on that. And I think we need research that sees families also as co-investigators and not just as subjects of investigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Once again, any questions or comments? Yes, Gilles.
Yes.
Then it appears important to really enter into the inner dynamics, the relations between the siblings, brothers, sisters, and then parents, and eventually grandparents. Not to use only this notion of family
Absolutely.
as being a unit, total unit. It's not a family, it's individual members engaged differently in the taking care of. And secondly, structures of family, more has to be said about
Absolutely.
what kind of organization we have as a family structure. These are only remarks by an anthropologist.
I completely agree, and we're trying to take into account some of these things in this sort of second phase by looking at both structure of family and also asking people who's in the family, how they define family, what roles these individuals play. So hopefully we'll have more nuanced answers after the second phase of the study. Thank you for those comments.
Thank you very much.